All right, welcome back for the final part of section five today. We're going to start with the horrors of war. And so on both sides, most soldiers were under the age of 21. And as the death toll rose, age restrictions for soldiers will really start to be relaxed a lot more. The South will draft boys as young as 17 and men as old as 50. And the boys would learn to stand firm as cannon blasts shook the earth and bullets whizzed past their ears, which is going to be kind of an unnerving thing. We'll talk about why here in a little bit. So soldiers would drill and march for long hours and would also sleep on the ground even if it was raining or snowing. So your living conditions were very, very uncomfortable as well. And oftentimes their clothing was poor and uncomfortable, and many soldiers would have no shoes. So outdated military tactics will also contribute to heavy casualties, and we'll talk about that a little bit more to come. And we'll talk about more as we get with those new technology we'll talk about. But soldiers would attack in straight lines or bunch together, which made them easy targets for both artillery and rifle fire. So remember how we talked in the Revolutionary War? Both sides basically march up to each other and take turns shooting. Well, that practice really hasn't gone away yet, and we'll talk about here in a little bit why that's such a bad thing to not have been taken away. So, modern technology will add to the horror of war. Cone shaped bullets and guns with rifling, or grooves cut on the side of the barrel, made rifles twice as accurate. So, these cone shaped bullets were called Minet bullets. Yeah, it came from France. That's why it sounds weird. So, basically, it's a cone shaped bullet with the back part of it being hollow. So, that way, when it hits something hard like bone, basically, that bullet will go from I don't know about the diameter of your finger to about the size of a $half. Or if you don't know how big that is, it'll be like a 1 inch to an inch and a half wide circle being punched through you as it flattens out. And these Minet bullets shot out of these more modern rifles that have the rifling in them were accurate up to 500 yards. So now you're taking this rifle accurate up to 500 yards and you're marching at each other and shooting each other at point blank range. The results will be devastating to both sides, as we'll talk about. Improved cannons will also hurl exploding shells several miles and were much more deadly because they were able to be aimed so much easier. And so now, as these soldiers are all grouped together and they're using cannons to shoot exploding shells, you could take out an entire group of troops with one shell. Machine guns will also be introduced, and the first landmines will bring unexpected horrors to war as well. Those landmines, they will take legs and limbs off of people anywhere near them that step on them. As far as machine guns go, they weren't really introduced till the very end of the war, and those will be the Gatling guns, which are like a hand cranked barrel or hand cranked gun that is capable of automatic fire as you crank. And the person that invented the Gatling gun was actually a doctor. And the reason why he invented it is he thought it would bring about an end to war quicker, but instead it increased the total amount of carnage that would be wrought on the battlefield. And to help protect themselves, soldiers will start to dig trenches to protect themselves from these new weapons. But even with those trenches, almost 25% of soldiers in a battle will be killed or wounded, which is huge, huge, huge numbers of soldiers. And sometimes almost being wounded would be worse than being killed directly on the battlefield. Photographers were also able to spread the horrors of war with never before seen pictures of war. Prior to this, any picture of war was drawn by an artist that might have seen it. Now, photographers have cameras and they can capture exactly what is going on at that point in time on the battlefield. Hot, hot air balloons will also allow soldiers to see entire battlefields, and submarines will be used to sink ships as well. So during the Civil War, hot air balloons are going to become very prevalent in the war because you can get a higher elevation and you can see how the entire battle is unfolding, allowing commanders to better order troops around the field and making combat a little bit more effective. So the sick and wounded soldiers would face other horrors besides just the general fighting. Medical care was crude, especially on the battlefields, and surgeons routinely amputated injured arms and legs. So, because of these bullets being so devastating, um, when a soldier gets hit in an arm, most of the time the bone completely shatters and there's not a whole lot left of the arm or leg. So these surgeons would then just take a saw and cut off your limbs. And a lot of the surgeons during the Civil War, sorry, were nicknamed bone saws because they routinely just amputated limbs. Doctors also didn't know how germs cause infection and disease, which, as you can imagine, is not a good thing. This lack of knowledge will result in minor wounds often becoming infected, and poor sanitary conditions in the army camps will allow disease to spread rapidly. So, because they live so close together, if one person got sick, that disease spread throughout the entire camp. And a lot of soldiers would end up losing even more limbs or larger sections of their limbs because of wounds becoming infected. And a lot of times, these infected wounds would even lead to death. So, on both sides of war, prisoners face horrifying conditions. Andersonville is one of the most famous camps during the Civil War. This is a prison camp located in Georgia where many Union prisoners died of disease and starvation. So, because the South didn't have enough food to feed their own soldiers, they're not going to give that food to prisoners, and that's going to result in a lot of death in these prison camps. And these conditions would cause many soldiers to start deserting on both sides. And so, desertion means you're basically illegally leaving the military, and this is going to create a lot of issues. And many Northerners will also be opposed to using force to keep the South in the Union. They are like, look, if the South's willing to fight this hard for it, like, what's the point? And supporters of the war would call these people copperheads after the poisonous snake because they're not doing anything to actually help the war effort. So they're poisoning it for the North. And other Northerners supported the war but opposed how Lincoln was conducting it. So some people didn't like it because there was actual fighting. Other people liked the war, but well, they just didn't like Lincoln and how he was running it. So you really can't make anybody happy. And so as the war drags on, public support will dwindle and there would be a shortage of volunteers for the Union. So to deal with this, Congress will pass a draft law in 1863 requiring all able-bodied males between the ages of 20 and 45 to serve in the military if they were called upon. But there are ways to get out of this. A man could avoid the draft by paying $300, which is about as much as an unskilled worker would earn in a year, making it, well, basically impossible for an unskilled worker to do this, or by hiring someone else to serve in their place. So it allowed the rich people to get out of fighting in war. And many people began to see the Civil War as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And it's not just going to be in the North. As we talk here in a little bit, you'll see it in the South as well. So the rich people will be able to avoid the war, while the poor people will be stuck fighting it for them. And so opposition to the draft would lead to riots in several northern cities because the law went into effect soon after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, leading some white Northerners to believe that they were now being forced to fight to end slavery, which they really didn't want to end to begin with. And many people in northern cities, especially recent immigrants, saw little reason for wanting to slavery abolished. And so mainly immigrants are going to feel that freed African Americans would compete for them with jobs and drive down wages. And so this would be the main reason why both immigrants and people in the North didn't want African Americans freed from slavery. However, the worst riot will take place in New York City in July of 1863, while white Northerners attacked free African Americans and rich whites. So they attacked the free African Americans because they viewed it as their fault. They were now fighting to basically free them. And they attacked the rich white people in town because, well, those are the people that are avoiding the draft because they have money. So they're going to loot all these houses and kill people. And so, in the end, at least 74 people would be killed during this 4-day riot. And Lincoln would move to stop riots and other disloyal practices and would suspend this thing called habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a Latin word that basically gives you the right to be charged or have a hearing before being jailed. So Lincoln will actually suspend this right. So under with the lack of habeas corpus, basically Lincoln can throw you in jail and not charge you of any crimes or give you a trial, and you just kind of sit there and yeah, you're stuck in jail for a long period of time. Not a good thing. And so this will be really controversial, but Lincoln will defend it because he's doing what's good for the common people and the common good of the nation by suspending the writ of habeas corpus, as it is called. So the South also going to have issues because President Jefferson Davis will struggle to create a strong federal government for the Confederacy, and many Southerners firmly believe in states' rights. In other words, they feel the state has a right to basically refuse to do what the federal government says, which makes the federal government really, really powerless. And so they'll resist paying taxes to central government. And at one point, Georgia even threatens to secede from the Confederacy. So there's no making these states happy. Like, Yeah, they already split away from the Union, and now they're talking about splitting away from the Confederacy. Like, come on, man. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, you got to be able to compromise with somebody at some point. However, Georgia's kind of really extreme at this, and so just over taxes to the central government, their states are going to basically refuse to pay them. And so, like the North, the South was also forced to pass a draft law to fill its army. And men who owned slaves or supervised more than 20 slaves would be exempt from the draft. And this would be very few and far between. The larger plantation owners obviously would be exempt, leaving the the poorer farmers in the South and people that don't own slaves or that many slaves, forced to go and fight. Well, the rich, once again, stayed home. And this isn't the only war throughout American history that has this problem. We'll talk more about that when you guys get to high school. And near the end of the war, the South no longer had enough white men to fill the ranks, and so they would draft slaves to fight for them. However, the war ended before more than a few thousand enslaved men actually fought for the Confederacy. So, yeah, these enslaved African Americans were forced to fight to keep themselves in slavery. So you can imagine that went over really well. And so the economy will also struggle in both the North and the South. The North, to pay for the war, they collected income tax or tax on people's wages, and they would also issue bonds. Machines to aid with farming were invented to make up for people that went off to fight. And factories were busy producing goods for war and making money. So the North did fairly well. Yeah, they had some issues with inflation, which I'll explain here in a second. But for the most part, the Northern economy actually benefited from the war because these factories are open and making money. Whereas the South, the Union blockade successfully cut off trade for the South, which means all that cotton sat there and was basically useless. They couldn't make any money. So the cotton industry would be ruined because of the war. High inflation made goods too expensive for people to buy. So money was basically worthless. And a majority of war was fought in the South, and many farms, homes, and towns would be ruined by fighting. And we'll talk more about that in section 6 as well. So the economy in the South ruined. The North actually came out pretty good because of the war. And so women in the North and South will play vital roles during the war. As men left for the battlefields, women took over the jobs in industry and on farms, as well as raised their families. So women played a big part in the war. Some women would disguise themselves even and enlist in the army, and some would serve as spies or work in the camps. So women would form aid societies to help supply troops with food, bedding, clothing, and medicine. And they didn't stop there. Women on both sides would work as nurses. And at first, doctors were unwilling to permit even trained nurses to work in military hospitals. But as wounded men began to swamp these camps and these hospitals, this is going to start changing. Women will perform so well during the war that nursing will become an accepted occupation for women. And actually, nursing today is even a field dominated by women. And Dorothea Dix and Clara Barton were founders of the American Red Cross, or well, Clara Barton is the founder of the American Red Cross, and both will become nurses for the Union Army. And women from both sides would serve diligently as nurses, aiding surgeons, and in the hospital caring for wounded. And this won't be the last time that women will step up, take jobs in industries, work farms, raise a family all on their own while the men go off to fight. You're going to see this happen during World War One as well as during World War Two. So keep that in mind that women's role and the more roles they play in society during times of war like this will only increase their stature in the nation. So that's the end of section 5. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me or hop on Zoom. Also, you need to complete the section 5 quiz online. So once you get that done, make sure you turn it in and I'll get it graded. Grades are as up to date as of right now as well. So if you see you're missing something, you're missing it.